If you read the title of the video, then you already know how I feel about this game. It's fantastic. This game perfectly captures the feeling of the original and, dare I say, improves upon it at times. This remake keeps the original mostly intact with just a few changes to update it to modern standards. This includes adding new locations and expanding on some existing ones. Now, it has been a very long time since I played the original game, but as far as I remember, nothing got removed here except some dialogue. Now, this should be the gold standard of how to go about remaking a classic. While the Resident Evil remakes are great, it's a shame that some parts of the original games were sometimes completely taken out. If that section of the original game sucks, then I would just much prefer them to rework it rather than remove it entirely. One of the first heavily changed areas in this game was the hospital, and I absolutely loved what they did with it. Exploring the hospital with all of the puzzles and backtracking really invoked that classic survival horror gameplay experience that we all know and love. And honestly, this is probably the scariest game I have played since Resident Evil 7. The atmosphere and the sound design are top notch. The soundtrack still kicks ass, and this is the best the iconic Silent Hill fog has looked since the original Silent Hill 2. And man, do they pay a lot of respect to that game. In the remake, there are some things that you can find that are called glimpses of the past. They serve as callbacks to some events in the original game. There are way more of these than I expected. I think around 26. And every time you find one, it's like being smacked across the face with nostalgia. The attention to detail here absolutely blew me away. Small things like James's nails getting dirtier as the game progresses, to even some smaller details that I don't want to spoil, but pay attention to the save screen as you progress in the later stages of the game. On top of the echoes, there's even some other details thrown in that can contribute to some popular theories about the story of the game. And speaking of James, I need to give a massive shout out to his voice actor. Luke Roberts absolutely stole the show. This has to be one of my favorite vocal performances in a video game ever. If this man does not win the Game Award for Best Performance this year, he got robbed. The range of emotion that James portrays felt very real, especially in one of the new endings. And I should probably mention that they added 2 new endings to the game, and I think that both of them are great. They both capture the essence of what the original game wanted to convey, and they fit in with the narrative. I think the only problem is that one of the new endings is a little similar to one of the original ones. Actually, more than a little similar. It's almost the same thing. So, it kind of makes that old ending feel redundant. Moving along the list of things that have been changed for the better, the combat. In the original game, combat was secondary. It was slow, clunky, and mostly unnecessary, as you could just run past most of the enemies in that game. I believe that the route that they took with the combat in this version was perfect. It is much more responsive, but still very simple, as James is just a normal person, not a soldier or a fighter. He can take on one monster, but add several, and things get dicey. The dodge feels great, and once you get the hang of it, you can play this game like you're playing Dark Souls and fight bosses with your metal pipe only. It's kind of fun. And man, does the combat feel weighty. Some of that can be attributed to the PS5 controller and its adaptive triggers and rumble and all that, but melee attacks feel impactful, and the guns even more so. Being able to shoot the enemies in their knees to make them fall over, blasting a nurse with the shotgun, making them fly backwards, the combat just felt good. And on top of that, the boss fights have been improved immensely as well. There's one boss fight in particular that was improved so much that it has become my favorite moment of the game. Small note that I want to bring up, I already mentioned how the controller does well for combat. They also made the controller serve as your in-game radio, which does wonders for immersion. Hearing the static signaling that monsters are nearby coming from your controller speaker, something that you're physically holding, it it makes it so much scarier. Now, unfortunately, this game is not perfect, so it's time to list my complaints. First, the combat. Now, I know I said previously that I really like the combat. That wasn't a lie. I still think the actual fighting of the monsters is perfect. My problem is that the game makes you do it a little more than I would have liked. Some of my favorite moments of the game is when you're walking around in silence just exploring. That feeling of mystery and isolation was scarier to me than being in a room with nurses and having to fight all the time. Sometimes it just felt like I would go into a room, kill 3 monsters, then go into the next room and have to kill 4 more monsters. The overuse of combat killed the tension, and enemies became more of an annoyance than anything else. Going 5 minutes of puzzle solving in silence to then be randomly jumped at by a mannequin you couldn't see was far better than being trapped in a room and having to kill 3 and then they move on. I'm happy that they made the enemies more of a threat because they were really nothing more than obstacles in the original, though I wish the game would let me pick and choose my battles more. I kind of felt forced to fight more often than not, and I would have really liked to be able to just like maneuver around enemies more, which you could do when you're out in the streets, but when you're in these tight hallways of like the apartments and the hospital, you really can't. So it would have been fine if there was just less enemies overall. But with how many there were, after a certain point, I was getting a little tired of it. Especially with the lack of enemy variety in this game. Not counting bosses, there's really only 3 enemy types to fight, and they each come in 2 variations. However, only the mannequin variant actually feels like I'm fighting something different. So while it should feel like 6 enemy types, it only feels like 4. My other main complaint stems from how the game looks and runs. The performance is not great. My frames were dropping consistently throughout my playthrough. And while the game looks absolutely stunning, there are some visual effects that can really take away from the experience. The first of which being motion blur. If you're playing on PC, you can turn it off. But if you're playing on PS5 like I was, there was no option to do so. The motion blur was so bad, I had to take breaks every 30 minutes because I was getting headaches and starting to feel nauseous. It was so bad that I contemplated just buying the game again on Steam so that I could actually play the damn thing. However, I found that if you raise your camera sensitivity, it actually helps a lot. Just that simple change, and I was able to play fine completely after that. Like 4 hours straight, no headache. So if you suffer from the same thing that I do, definitely raise your sensitivity. It helps. Hello, future John here. That issue I just mentioned about not having an option to turn off motion blur on PS5 has now been fixed as of patch 1.04. This literally came out as I am recording this video on October 21st. I will keep this last section of the review in because this review was based off of my experience playing the game at launch, so it was worth noting, but if you get the game after this point, you luckily will not have to go through what I did. Alright, Past John, you may continue. The game also suffers from a lot of visual ghosting. Some hallways look terrible when all of the specks of dust in the air have after images following them. It got so annoying that at one point I had to turn on high contrast mode so that I can actually see something. I have never had to turn on an accessibility setting in a game before now. Lastly, very small complaint. While most of the dialogue changes were for the better, I think there were a few moments where the original version of the scene hit harder than in the remake. This almost wasn't worth mentioning, but there is one scene in particular that I have in mind that, in my eyes, was made much worse in this game because of the removal of a few lines. It's a shame, because that was one of my favorite scenes in the original, so I was dissatisfied with the new version that we got. Man, I really wanted to give this game a 10, but the performance issues, the constant visual ghosting, and the slight overuse of combat held this game back from perfection. So, my final score for Silent Hill 2 is going to be a 9 of hearts. Bloober Team knocked it out of the park with this one, and I really hope that they decide to remake the first and third game as well. I also saw that they recently announced a new survival horror game that they called Chronos. Alright, Bloober, you've got my attention, so I'll be there. Hope you don't let me down. Well, those are my thoughts on Silent Hill 2. Later.